Hi, John.
Howdy.
We're here. We're
here.
back. It's been a couple months. Gosh, a lot's happened. It is springtime, so everybody's been applying for tags everywhere. What else? We've been fishing a little bit. Mm-hmm. You and I caught some bluegill.
I got my first fish on the fly.
You did.
Just a couple days ago.
Impressed.
So,
and and
little bluegill.
I did some carp fishing with Digger. That was a blast. Mm-hmm. I like to tell everybody how many fish we caught. We caught 63 carp in one day, and Digger caught 53 of them.
Yeah, I was going to say, we is a very...
He caught 53, but I got double digits, so I was stoked.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Big episode today.
Mm-hmm.
Really excited about this.
Yeah. Do you want to go ahead and introduce our esteemed guest?
My old friend, a wonderful human, and I'm very happy to see him back spreading the good gospel. Land Tawney is with us today. Hi, Land.
Thanks for having me, Tim, and I would shoot right back at you. You're a great human being, not just a good one, a great human being.
He is. He really is.
Everybody, we met in tents. We were camping. Remember that? That was a good time.
Oh yeah, the corner crew.
The corner crew. Land and I met years ago at a BHA rendezvous in Missoula, and just connected and remained sort of in touch with a core group of people. And I think it was, given the current state of everything going on in the world today and in America today, I'd reached out to Land a few weeks ago. He was busy in Washington, D.C. for a little while, fighting the good fight, and we'll get in more into that later. But and I just felt like it was like, Land's got to come on and talk to us and teach us and educate us and our people a little bit, because I've learned so much from you, Land, and so I want to keep like spreading that gospel forward, pay it forward, as they say.
And for the viewers, Land, maybe just a quick little intro, just kind of who you are, what you're doing, what you were doing previously, going from BHA to now American Hunters and Anglers. So maybe just a quick little background on that.
Sure. So I'm based here in Missoula, Montana, but I've been working on kind of national conservation policy for almost 25 years. I used to work for the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership and then the National Wildlife Federation, and then had just an amazing time at Backcountry Hunters and Anglers for a decade, and really got to work with Tim and volunteers all across the country that, to me, like, is the driving force behind Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, really, and help grow that organization. But every single person that was part of that organization helped grow it, and so I had the good fortune of being at the top, but meeting people all across the country, seeing landscapes all across the country, and doing some amazing things out in Washington, D.C. A lot of people don't think their voices count anymore, and I think at BHA we turned that on its head and really showed hunters and anglers who a lot of times don't want to get involved in policy, that you can get involved in policy. And when you do, you might not win every single time, but your voice only matters if you use it. And so really, helping folks understand that. It was such a great community too, Tim. I mean, we talk about the corner, but there's so many relationships across the country that I was able to make and maintain still today, just because we all, kind of thought the same way. And that was an amazing time for me. I also have two young kids. My daughter is 17, she's 16, will turn 17 this summer. My son just turned 14, and for 10 years they didn't have as much as their dad as they wanted, and I didn't have as much as my kids as I wanted either. And so after a decade, stepped back and had a glorious kind of year and a half where I fished a lot, hunted a lot, went to a lot of soccer games.
Your daughter's a big soccer player, right?
She is. She's. We're looking at colleges right now, and it's really fun, but it's also daunting to try to make a choice, or for her to make a choice, not me, but for her to make a choice.
Yeah.
But she wants to play soccer in college, and she can do that, and so it's just finding the right program. But got to reconnect, with my family. And I hate to say that, but it was a lot of travel and a lot of way, and this year and a half was great. And after the election, being a part of the first Trump administration, understanding where Congress was, is that you could see kind of some things coming. And, I'm I'm a fighter at heart and really wanted to step back in the arena. And so a friend of mine, who I've done work with over the last 20 years he used to work for Senator Baucus here in Montana. That's where we first met each other. But then we've been kind of doing stuff since then, focused on Land and Water Conservation Fund in particular. And we decided to put something together. And really the car was already built. He had put this together in I guess it was like 2016 for another campaign, but really didn't do anything with it. So American Hunters and Anglers was sitting there. It was already ready to go. And we said, let's go do it. And the major difference with us at American Hunters and Anglers is that our designation is different. So we're a C4. Right. This is super nerdy, but I think it's important for people to understand. Sure. And so C3s, like Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, Trout Unlimited, Mule Deer Foundation, Wild Sheep Foundation, the list kind of goes on.
Yeah.
Those are all great organizations, but they're limited on what they can do around policy. And so basically they can only spend 20% of their overall budget focused on trying to get people to weigh in on policy. It's called grassroots lobbying or in general lobbying. And so let's say BHA, at our height had a budget of $5 million. That means, you can spend $1 million on advocacy, which doesn't sound like that much, but you start adding in staff time, and then you start adding in trips out to Washington, D.C., you start adding in just advocacy online, that kind of stuff. It adds up pretty quickly. C4, you're not limited at all to lobbying or grassroots lobbying. So I'm not really a lobbyist. Once in a while, I do go out to D.C. I don't have to register because it's not a majority of my time. But the majority of what we do is try to tell people what's going on, which we can do every single day because there's no limits, and then ask them to get engaged. And so that's a major difference. Second major difference is that C3s can't get involved in elections. Mm-hmm. And so...
What do you mean, like, involved, Land?
That's great. So, like, they can't say who you should vote for. They can talk about issues till they're blue in the face. Well, that 20%, I guess, and really help people make that decision on their own. But they can't say, go vote for candidate X. Right. Or they can't contribute money to candidate X. Right. What they can do as a C3, which we tried to do at BHA a couple of times, was do candidate questionnaires. And that is like getting as close as the line as you can. Then you can just report the news after that. But, not all candidates want to answer those questions because those questions are leading for sure, and they're going to give the wrong answer, and they don't want that publicized. And so that was difficult. With the C4, you can get involved in elections. And so, I think I've been doing election work just kind of on the side for 25 plus years too. And I think it's a missing piece in the sportsman's world right now. And really, that's why we started this. And so, in short, it's really utilizing kind of media, which is traditional media. So think, Field and Stream, Outdoor Life, kind of the big publications, Washington Post, New York Times. Right. But mostly it's focused on social media. And it's kind of embarrassing, but more than half the people in this country now get their news on social media. Yeah. And you can either be like, that just sucks because it's in 60 to 90 second blurbs, right? Or you could try to like influence that. And so we decided that we wanted to influence that, and really got up and running back in January, just a couple days after the president was sworn in. And we've been, doing policy stuff every single day since then. And I'm super excited about what we've established. Excuse me. It's been all organic, which means we haven't paid for anything yet. We're just starting to figure out some fundraising, so we will start to be able to do some paid stuff. But we've grown a network, on the Instagram in particular. Had a couple of videos that have been seen almost by a couple 100,000 people. And so as a startup, and really just starting in January, we're pretty excited about that. And really just, again, trying to inform the people about what's going on, and then giving them an opportunity to take action. And every single day, we don't have to, worry about pissing off corporate partners, pissing off, members. Our job is to really kind of just report the news and then let people sort it out for themselves. So that's a long way of me saying, that's too long of me talking, but that's kind of where I've been a little bit and what we're doing now.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. I think was listening to, I forget what the podcast was, but
it was Outdoor Life. Yeah,
Outdoor Life. It was kind of just finding a little bit more about you and stuff, and and also what's going on right now and why this stuff is really important. But before we kind of get into some of those current events, in a way, I'd almost love to hear your story a little bit, because you mentioned it a little bit. I think you said 5th generation. Your family's been in Montana for a really long time. you grew up hunting and fishing day one. So I'm curious, like maybe tell me a little bit more about that, but also how that maybe kind of brought you to where you are today. Like what about that life, that generational outdoor hunting, fishing, family life has made you so passionate about not just, sticking with BHA, but moving on and then trying to, building what you're building now with American hunters and anglers and kind of beyond just the type of organization you are, but why? Like why do you want it to be like that? And I know some of it is a little bit of, you want to be aggressive, you want to get in there, you want to make some change, you want to, make some waves, but yeah, maybe kind of unpack that a little bit for us. What was it like growing up in Montana?
Well, John, thanks for that question. And, I had the very good fortune of having two parents that were involved in conservation. My parents were the first full-time conservation lobbyists at the state legislature. My mom kind of stepped back when she started having kids, but my dad continued that. And I'm going to law school late in life. I think he was 35 when he went to law school. And then, really that's when conservation easements were coming to things. So conservation easements on private land, it's up to the private landowner to say, I want to keep this place the way it is right now in perpetuity. So they put a conservation easement on it. Mm-hmm. My dad was heavily involved in that. And at that point, that's right when the Elk Foundation was starting too. So 1985, my dad wrote their articles of incorporation and their bylaws with their first lawyer until he passed away in 95. And so as a kid, I would go either to the state legislature or I would go to these meetings. I grew up on my dad's back fishing when he took me, duck hunting for my first time when I think I was 8 and I couldn't, shoot anything, but I brought my BB gun, just in case that golden little BB could kill something. Never did, by the way. Yeah. But really like those memories of being on my dad's back, the salmon fly hatch on the Big Hole River, seeing those fish take those flies, being in the duck blind early and watching that, thunderous eruption of ducks when they come off the water early in the morning, before when you're setting decoys, there'd be a bunch of birds in front of the blind where we were, or hunting elk where literally I had to step in every single one of my dad's footsteps because the snow was so deep that if I didn't do that, I wouldn't be able to walk. And so I think that, along with those meetings, kind of created this, this deep love for hunting and fishing. And then the conservation side, I'll be honest, like I wasn't super interested in what my parents were doing. I think it was more like osmosis, which is kind of seeping into me. Yeah. At the same time, Jim Posowitz, who's an author and has written, I think, 5 or 6 books. He's no longer with us, but great conservation leader. He was my godfather, and when I was born, he took me to the hospital, and my mom to the hospital. Excuse me, not me. I wasn't born yet, but he took my mom to the hospital, and so I was around kind of like great leaders, but it wasn't like, when I went to school, I went to Seattle University first. Man, I was chasing girls, getting a business degree, and like really, having a good time. That was kind of like where my head was at that point. And then my father got sick with leukemia and passed away, and that's still, I'm 50 years old right now. That happened when I was 19, and it's still the biggest hole in my life. And I don't, it's not great. But I will say that one night and I can almost pin it down to one night, I was out late night carousing with friends, came home after 2 o'clock in the morning, going up Patty Canyon, which is just outside of Missoula. It's like a 3-mile drive. And it's, just late at night, dark out, and this mountain lion runs across in front of me. And it stops, and then it kind of looks at me, turns around, and runs back in front of in front of these headlights again. And that powerful kind of, just glass shoulders, like it just glided across the road both times. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to get cheesy. And it looked at me, and I thought it was my dad, and like anything like that. It was just like this moment that was like, I found myself. And the silver lining of my dad passing away is that like I came home from Seattle and then got a wildlife biology degree at the University of Montana, and then started volunteering for the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Alliance. It was at that point. Yeah. Bob Munson, who helped start the Elk Foundation, was the leader at that point, and I volunteered for him and then worked into a part-time job and a full-time job, and he kind of let me grow my wings. Then he left. And then Jim Range, who is just, he's no longer with us either, but he was the chairman of TRCP. TRCA changed into TRCP, which is the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. And Man, he was a Republican that was the chief of staff under Howard Baker. He lived out in D.C., he had a place in Montana. He was an avid bird hunter, avid fisherman. And he helped write the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. So like, this is like, you know, like he helped put wolves back in Yellowstone. Like he was like a conservationist to the T.
Yeah.
And didn't apologize for it. And was pretty aggressive. Like he was a pretty quiet dude, but in closed meetings, he was pretty aggressive. And I saw him cry multiple times around conservation. And so I paint this picture of just like these amazing mentors, and there's many more, but that really instilled this, and again, like at first by accident, but now very purposely for the last 25 years of just, you know, if it's not us, who is it? And you got to speak up for the resource. And, you know, I think about like Aldo Leopold and all parts matter, kind of, you know, the thing is right when it tends to, you know, uphold the integrity, the stability, and the beauty of a biological community, but is wrong when it does otherwise. That's a pretty simple thing to kind of be a barometer on how you make decisions. And I feel like in this world, there's so many, you know, people are worried about making somebody mad, or they have, you know, some of this, they want their help on some other issue. So they're not willing necessarily to step up for the things that matter. And I think at BHA, I think we did that every single day. I think that was a role that we played. I think that we were limited in that, as I discussed earlier, kind of the differences of the organizations. But that passion, I think, is driven by the people that I was around, the people I've met all across the country. And then now, as I'm 50 years old, it's like, how do you, which I don't even feel like I'm old yet, by the way. Like, I feel like I'm pretty freaking young. Maybe that's just mentally. I'm physically starting to feel it a little bit. But, you know,
same.
I'm starting to realize this juxtaposition that, you know, man, I've learned a lot. And how do you pass that on to the next generation? And so they have something to fight for. Like, this conversation about conservation is really only 150 years old in this country. Right. My 25 years is a small blip of that. But those who come after us are just going to have to do the exact same things that we're doing today. It might look different. The pressures might look different. But, you know, this kind of experiment that we have in this country is fairly new. And to be a part of it, and to, you know, again, share that with volunteers, members, colleagues, has been the joy of my life. And, you know, I want my kids and my grandkids, you know, if I'm that lucky someday, to really, you know, kind of have that instilled in them kind of the way I did, maybe a little bit more purposely than I did, and have to have me pass away for them to realize that it's something they want to engage in. But nah, John, like I got the good fortune to go out on the river on Monday of this week, and it's the salmon fly hatch right now in Montana, and these bugs are like as big as my finger. Yeah. And so these fish have been eating these small little midges or whatever, like, you know, all winter. And then they, like, all of a sudden these big pieces of protein get out there. And it's like, it's unbelievable how aggressive they get. And this place where I go, I'm not going to totally mention, but it's got public lands on both sides of it. It's wild, wild country. And to sit there, you know, at lunch, we're eating fried chicken on the side of the river.
Nice.
And we've caught, you know, 30 fish before lunch. We catch another 30 afterwards. These are all kind of just wild trout, man. That, like, no fish are stocked. They depend on that habitat. And you just realize that none of that happened by accident, and none of it's going to be carried forward by accident either. And so I'm totally grounded. You know, I think Edward Abbey said, be a part-time advocate. You know, you got to get outside. Yeah. And I'm a full-time advocate in a lot of ways, but I think these times, you know, that time that I took off for a year and a half, and just that Monday, those check-ins, you know, I'm supposed to go fishing again tomorrow. Like that is what we're trying to do. You know, you can talk about the outdoor economy, you know, that's $1.2 trillion in this country. That depends on public lands. You can talk about clean air and clean water. You can talk about, you know, finding your solace out there. But at the end of the day, like, these public lands are available to all of us. Yep. And no matter what they provide to you, I think it's our responsibility, you know, as Americans, really, which our system is unique in the world, and again, only about 150 years old, this part of it. Like, damn, man, it's our job to carry that forward. So that's, again, me talking a lot, but I just, you know, I appreciate things like this, you know, be on a podcast and just kind of talk about where I came from and why, you know, I want to do what I do.
Yeah, and to that note, when you talked about the mountain lion, I don't think it's cheesy at all. And if anything, like, the way you're talking about fishing too. It's a similar experience. You're engaging with the outdoors, and something happens.
Totally.
If anything, like the beauty of it is that it's not only just fun, but they become these sort of like markers in our life, these experiences. Like when I'm new to this, so I just got into this a few years ago, and my first hunt was wild boar. So I got a sow, and that was just, massive point in my life. Just like the trajectory of my life, I think, changed after that point. And I think that's really cool. And I think beyond that too, like just hearing you talk about this, it's almost like beyond the animals, beyond the actual hunting, fishing, there's a weight to the concept of public land. And I was thinking about this a lot listening to that podcast you were just on, because out here we have, a number of spaces. There's some military bases you can hunt on, but there's this one spot that's just outside of one of those military bases. And I can't explain it, but even though the military base is huge and massive and fun, once you get into that public space, there is a weight to it. And it's beautiful, so that's definitely part of it, but you feel it. You feel like it's just there. Like this is just ours. And that's a new thing for me, kind of getting into this and experiencing what it means to be on public land. Because I think before I started hunting and fishing, it's like a forest. It's like a recreational. It's going to Yosemite. But when you are free to hunt and fish, there's something about that gives some weight to that land because you're able to participate in it. And so I think with what you're doing, and for the listeners and watchers, viewers out there who are checking this out, I think that's what's important. And that's what I love about what you and people like you are doing is you're not just saving the land or the ecosystem, but it's our ability to participate in it. And once people start to do that, they feel that weight. It's everyone I've talked to, and there's been a few people that we've met that have kind of got into hunting over the past couple of years through this shop, and I can see that. And I think that's just a really wonderful thing.
And I think I'll piggyback, and then I'll parlay this into a question for Land. But it's not just hunting and fishing. It's bird watching and camping and hiking and whatever else you can think to do recreationally outside. And Land, we've joked about this over the years, and you've heard it time and time again, and I'm sure you may still with American hunters and anglers. Talk to me a little bit about those people that have no interest in hunting and have no interest in angling, and why they should participate in organizations like American Hunters and Anglers or Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. Maybe they don't believe in, procuring food via hunting at all. But why is this sort of important? And then after this, we can get into a little bit of like the current state of the union.
Sure. So, I go back to almost something John said, right? Like that weight that you feel when you're on public lands. Like these are these places that belong to us. No matter how much money you have, doesn't matter who your parents are, doesn't matter who you voted for in the last election. They belong to all of us. And so, we're coming at this, from a hunting and fishing perspective. I also am a crazy birder. I'm getting more and more as I get older. I think that maybe shows my age, but I love seeing these birds out when I'm hunting and fishing. They enrich my experience. I mountain bike, I'm on my raft with my kids all the time when we're not fishing. And so, but I think that this opportunity to go out there again, no matter who you are, it's such a powerful thing. And, that we may have a different relationship. I think, John, again, like we have an active participation, like with animals and whereas, somebody that's going kayaking is, they'll see a great blue heron or, a American dipper or something that's, a water ouzel, I think is the other name for that bird. But they'll see them and they'll be impressed with that. But when we're killing things, we're looking at that in a much different way. And I think it's a different, intimate relationship. Yeah. And while some people are like, I can't believe you're killing those animals, I'm like, I love these animals and I want to make sure that their habitats are there forever. And I love all the other animals that make up that ecosystem that they're involved in, right? And so I think there's this shared, while we kind of have a different relationship with the outdoors, I think, that same solace I feel, when I'm getting stressed out and I go out into the woods, that's that person that takes a hike, that person that goes mountain biking, they're feeling the same thing. And I think there's more and more opportunity to kind of find that common ground. And right now, in my 25 years, there's been like the pressure on our public lands is bigger than it ever has been, and more intense than it ever has been, and from more angles. Like once in a while we would deal with one angle, and then like that would go away, and then we move on to another one.
Right.
This is like so much pressure.
Right.
That like to not embrace folks that maybe don't look like you or don't recreate the same way you do. I think it's a total fallacy, man. I think we're setting ourselves up for failure, and so. I think, working with folks that, look at the woods a little bit different than we do, I think it's super important, this whole conversation. Yeah. And that doesn't mean we give away our values or anything like that. I think it's we find common ground.
Right.
We find a common enemy right now. We unite together. And I think that is really, one of the silver linings that might come out of all this pressure is that we find out that we can come together. And when we do, we can change things.
Definitely.
Yeah. And I John talked about this store being a catalyst for a lot of conversation and education, and a lot of that is just like welcoming those people that may sit a little bit different and from a perspective standpoint, and trying to say, hey, let me teach you about this, let me talk to you about that, let me show you about this public land that's within a 20-minute drive of here that you can go enjoy with your kids, and and so it's all about finding that common ground and finding that conversation, that voice. But it's you mentioned
the food
it,
too, right? We haven't talked about food. Sorry to cut you off there.
Yeah.
But food is such a great pathway, and for people thinking about like organic is such a for good reason, right? Like you do not want your stuff pumped full of stuff. And there couldn't be anything more organic, than like the fish you catch or the animals that you kill, and then eat those. And I think that's such a great way to have those conversations with people. This is one of the reasons I do this is because it's for health reasons. Plus, I think it's sustainable and for the ecosystem and, all sorts of levels of that. But like food is such an important connector, I think, in this whole conversation. So sorry about that, Tim.
No, that's you're absolutely right. And it's a really hard argument to make, to say like, oh, I'm anti you catching and eating your own food, that comes from the land. And, I guess the response is, I guess you're really into factory farming. That's your thing.
I mean, the alternative is not great, right? And whether that's like the thing that you're actually eating or the conditions they're in, right? Like, what I love about these wild animals is they're wild and free.
Yeah.
And, I feel remorse every single time I kill an animal, but I'm also very, very thankful that I have the opportunity to be able to do that. And now I get to go share that with my family and friends and, sustain myself. And I think that is a powerful thing that, we should stay connected to the ground.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit what's going on right now.
I was just gonna say.
I'm not going to say anything. Tell us a little, you've been very busy. As have many, many people in your circle and our circle. But maybe tell us what started happening here, 6-8 weeks ago, and then bring us up to speed where we're at right now, if you would, with public lands in America.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mentioned before that I haven't seen threats like this in my entire career, and I talked to people that have been in this, twice as long as I have, and they're saying the same thing. And so I think that I would start in a general kind of way, and then I'll get more specific if that makes sense. So I think this is, the threat of privatization of our public lands has always been around. Like, people have been wanting to exploit our public lands since Roosevelt really set aside the first forest reserves, which became our national forest system.
Right.
And at that point, that was timber barons in the West, Midwest in particular, like Michigan, Minnesota, but then also getting into Montana and Idaho, where they just want to rape and pillage with no idea of future generations. They just want to make that quick buck. And so at that point, that's when Roosevelt was like, hey, we can still take timber off of these lands, but we have to do it in a sustainable fashion. We can't do it all at once, and we have to do it, so that future generations can have the same opportunities, with timber in particular. And so I think that's the basis of our system, but it's always been trying to be privatized. And right now, just in general, they're trying to defund our public lands, and I'll talk about that in specifics. They're trying to dismantle our public lands for the ultimate idea of divesting our public lands, which is just a fancy word for selling it the fuck off. Yeah. And like that to me is very systematic. And so before the election, you had Project 25, and they laid all this stuff out, what they were going to do. Now you've had other, think tanks. There's one that's called Homesteading 2.0, where they want to just open up public lands, to homesteading, which sounds awesome. But that place I was fishing with, man, I'd love to get a place up there, but I guarantee you I couldn't afford it. Right? Like this is not
homesteading is just
It's going to go to the highest bidder, right? There's so much money to be made. I mean, we're sitting on some of the most untapped wealth probably in the world when it comes to real estate in particular.
Yeah. And that word is marketing at its best. Homesteading.
Homesteading
sounds so granola, and it is.
It totally does, and it's available to everybody. Well, that's not the way it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And so that's the general playbook. And so right after the election happened, the House came in and they changed the rules, which is super boring and technical. Like nobody really looked at it. But they changed these rules, and so they said that they can sell or transfer public lands without having to consider the value of those public lands. Mm-hmm. And that to me is ludicrous when you think about, again, the real estate value that I just talked about. Yeah. Then you start talking about the recreational value, which is $1.2 million, which is based on this public land so that everybody can go. You start privatizing that and less people can go. Then I talked about clean air and clean water earlier and put a price tag on that stuff, right? Like, I mean, literally as we go forward, water
the value
in particular.
Is infinite.
Yeah, it's going to go exponentially forward, right? And so, when they did that, when the House came in, it was like, oh my God, here it comes. And then, you had I think Valentine's Day, right? Like on February 14th, the big axe that came down on our public land agencies when they were slashing kind of, Doge came in and Elon Musk and started, sure, there's probably some fat, no joke. Like there's probably some fat, but like that was not done with a scalpel with the idea of efficiency. That was done with a cleaver just to start, again, dismantling these agencies. Mm-hmm. And so that disrupted things in a huge way. It caused a lot of chaos. I talked to a woman today who is real familiar with the Fish and Wildlife Service. She thinks there's 20% more that's coming. And that's, and these are agencies they were already starved for budgets and already starved for people. Like they had too much work, they couldn't do it. And now you're just kind of undercutting that. So that's that dismantle kind of piece. You've had, some attacks, I think, on special places like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge up in Alaska or the Boundary Waters up in northern Minnesota. These special places that are just American gems that should not be touched, that are now being, potentially exploited. Those came out with presidential orders from the president, but now are showing up in this reconciliation bill, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But this whole fever kind of is building, right? And part of what I haven't talked about is that people are starting to talk out loud about the sale of public lands like they never have before. Mm-hmm. Tim, you'll remember back when Congressman Chaffetz tried to sell 3 million acres in the West. Yep. And he got his ass handed to him, right? Like he was a congressman from Utah that puts forward this legislation, and he did that on a Wednesday. A week later, he was pictured with an all camo clothes, holding a dog that didn't hunt, that wasn't even his dog, saying, "Oh, I've heard you," because the pushback from the people was so voracious around the sale of those public lands. Yeah. But that was one dude, got his ass handed to him, and people kind of were quiet about it. Now you have people like Mike Lee from Utah, who has been talking about this for decades, being even more bold. But that's starting to permeate into other places. And so you have the Utah state government. It was the governor who sued the federal government and said, I want to take all your Bureau of Land Management lands. Yep. They petitioned the Supreme Court. That goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court's like, no. Like, this land has always been the United States land. Like, you cannot have this land. It's not even getting it back. Like, it wasn't.
And wasn't Montana trying to piggyback that?
So Montana, there was a bunch of attorney generals basically across the country. There was 13 of them that signed on in support of that lawsuit.
Yeah,
Montana
that's what it was.
One of them. But there was also like North Dakota. I think there was even one from somewhere down south, like Arkansas or something, that doesn't have a lot of public land. But I say that is that Utah in that lawsuit was not like, that was a moonshot, like a Hail Mary to see if they could get this done. But they also had a $4 million PR campaign around that, and nobody petitions the Supreme Court with a campaign around them to do that. they're trying to win hearts and minds right, at that point. And so that's really creates this narrative again that, it's federal government land, like, we want to privatize that and make more money off it. And that, so that's been creeping in. And so then you go into like really this reconciliation bill, which is more recent. And within that bill, they wanted to sell, I think, upwards of 500,000 acres in Nevada, and then another 10,000 acres in Utah. And that was proposed by a couple of congressmen, one from Nevada, obviously, and Utah. And we started looking at that. At first, they were like, it's just a few thousand acres. And no, you start looking into it. I think ultimately Onyx came out and said it was like 1.5 million acres that was at stake. I think they might have overblown that just a little bit, but it was definitely north of 500,000 acres. And so the community started talking about this, and it became this Chaffetz moment that happened back in 2016. It was like, hell no, you're not going to do that, right? Like, like if you want to sell public land, there's a thing, and this is super nerdy, but it's called the Federal Land Transaction Facilitation Act, and it's been on the books forever. It looks at small pieces of property, of federal property. If you want to sell it, great. There's a public process that involves people on the ground, but anybody in the United States can get involved. And the best thing, the beauty of that, is that once it's sold, that money stays in the account to help buy up other public land or consolidate, like for like trails, for corridors, access corridors, also wildlife corridors. And it's been functioning, since it was established, I think in the early 80s. And so that's the way we should be doing this if we're doing it. This other way, especially to pay off, tax breaks for billionaires, which doesn't even come close because it's still, it's a huge addition to our deficit. But it's just this guys that try to privatize.
Yeah.
And so that happened, and the community got pissed. I was very thankful to see kind of every single organization come out, not only strong statements on, I think press releases and stuff like that, but I mean, I belong to the National Wild Turkey Federation. I get texts from them all the time to raise money, all the time. Like, here's this raffle or whatever it is. They use that, and I got my first one ever from that was advocacy, and it was basically like, this land sale is happening in the House Reconciliation Bill. Here's a link, contact your senator or your congressman, and like tell them to knock it off. And so that just tells you like the pushback that happened. And ultimately, they took it out, right, of this reconciliation bill, which is super rad. They listened to the people. That's what politicians are supposed to do. There's still some bad shit in there. There's still oil and gas development in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And for those that don't know about that, it's up in Alaska, and it was established when they were doing all the development on the North Shore, oil and gas. They said, we're gonna kind of mess this shit up over here. Let's protect this place called the Arctic, for caribou and a host of other species, but caribou in particular.
Right.
And so it was set aside, thinking forward for the people and keeping that, for them. And then I already talked about the boundary waters, right? The most visited wilderness in this country. It's in northern Minnesota. It's 1.1 million acres, where a 5-year-old to a 95-year-old can go into those boundary waters. There's language in there that permits a mine in there that, by the way, is a Chilean-owned mine. Like this family is from Chile. It's a copper sulfide mine that's just a quarter mile south of the boundary waters. All that water flows north and will devastate that area. So that's still in there. There's also some things around Land and Water Conservation Fund that are in there. But what was rad was that the people stood up and said, hell no, and the politicians listened, at least on the sale of public lands. And so that bill passed by only one frickin' vote in the House, right? Because it only had to be by majority. And now that process goes over to the Senate. And so what the Senate does is the Senate looks at this bill and they form their own bill, but they look at that bill and they're going to take portions of that and, a big chunk of that and make their own bill. And then these two bills come together in what they call conference, and then they hash it out, and then it has to be passed again in both chambers. And so, sorry for the in the weeds.
No, we need it.
Yeah.
But where we are now is that process is starting, and Senator Mike Lee, who is the number one
hates public land,
enemy of public land, is the chair of the Natural Resources Committee, Energy and Natural Resources Committee in the Senate, which means he's in charge of all public land policy, that goes forward or is proposed in the Senate. And he is talking voraciously about putting this provision back in. And I even heard today that it's going to be different and could be even larger than that around public land in general across the country. And so, that's the fight that we're going to see. They say they want to pass this legislation before July 4th recess. I think, that's a pretty aggressive timeline.
Yeah.
I was surprised that the House, passed their version as fast as they did. But they're getting pushed by the president in particular to get this thing done. The big, beautiful bill. I call it the big, ugly-ass bill. But when Elon Musk came out today, and bashed, we did a couple days ago, and then they've been going back and forth all day. So I think, this is not going to be as simple maybe as they think. But I will tell anybody that's listening that these politics feel bigger than you, and they kind of are, right? Like there's billionaires involved. You got the richest man in the world that, cut all these agencies and, went on stage with a chainsaw and was just obnoxious about it with no real idea of what the impacts are on the ground. And the sale of public lands is something we never get back, right? Like I think it feels overwhelming.
There's no more land.
Just
We're not growing.
Totally.
More.
It's not just like cutting an agency and then you're like, oh, you know what? Let's hire those people back. Once you start getting those homesteads built on these lands, there's not really any going back,
No, and I think in the budget that the president just proposed, it just slashes these agencies even more. And so, regardless who you voted for, it's the time to speak up. And I think that this last kind of piece that we talk about, that public land sale getting taken out of the House, is because people really came out of the woodwork and said, hell no. And they made phone calls, they blew up people on social media. And to me, that is just, everybody should see that worked, and we just need to figure out how to do that more often, and not just about the sale of public lands. I think that's, one of the easier ones that turns people on, because they can see that's gone forever, as you described, John. They're not making any more of it.
Yeah.
But if we defile these public lands, or we sell out these public lands, like the Arctic, like the boundary waters, or like public lands in general, like, that's going to change their value, like for generations to come. And so I think we need to be paying attention to stuff besides the sale of public lands, but that's definitely the one that is the biggest threat.
Yeah. I think what's interesting about, like, even just, regardless of who you voted for, like that kind of mentality, I think there's something really almost philosophical about this. And it is interesting, we get so stuck on the left does this, the right does that. The right is all about the state. The left is about federal. And so if it's a federal thing that want the land, then if you're on the right, then you shouldn't, you know what I mean? Like, and so you get trapped into this like boxed in way of thinking. And I think that's why it's so cool, like your perspective and your willingness to, you're just kind of like, fuck it. I don't care who, what letter is by this politician's name. Are they there to think big picture and channeling Teddy Roosevelt a little bit and kind of going back, like getting out of this sort of modern way of thinking so that we can kind of return to what that really meant. It's not that so the federal government can just own the land. It's not about that. And I think that's what's really interesting. And there's a misconception of, oh, we'll just give it back to the states. And we've talked about that a little bit. But I'm wondering, how does that track with you? Like, how do you think about that almost philosophically? And how do you have that conversation with people to kind of break through those party lines? And on top of that, the current climate, which I think is starting to break through. I mean, we're seeing, mainstream media is kind of going away a little bit, and you're seeing all these different podcasts and shows and things popping up where people have these sort of amorphous political views that are really interesting because they're breaking the mold. Is that current climate maybe helping you a little bit, kind of cut through the noise and, do away with those sort of older party lines that are still kind of getting in the way of protecting these lands?
It's a great question, John. I think that I would answer that in a couple of different ways. I think that first, that there's this radical middle that I think is the majority of the country, like 80% of us, that like the far left doesn't represent and the far right doesn't represent, right? I mean, the far left is thinks that hunting shouldn't be something that we all do. And, at a state level in particular, they're taking action that way. Yeah. The far right wants to get rid of all public lands. They want to privatize them all. Like, those are extreme views. Mm-hmm. Where I think that radical middle is like where the majority of the country is. And so I think finding that, is very philosophical, right? Like, and how do you demand, whether you have a D, an R, or an I behind your name as a politician, how do we make our issues just like stuff that like is just universal? And I think it's really one of the ones right now that I think we can do that on. I think there's a lot of issues that it's too black and white, or people that are too divided over it. But when I think about public lands, public waters, public wildlife, it's this place where I think people, majority of this country, can come together. And so that's about, again, I talked about earlier, finding this common ground with, outdoor users that don't necessarily hunt or fish. I would say the same thing as finding common ground with people that, maybe don't have the same political views as you. But when you start talking to them, you're like, oh my goodness, like we agree on the majority of this. And so I think part of the job is to try to like really elevate that radical middle, and so that we don't go on this pendulum. You have like an election and things go this way, and then you have an election and things go the other way. Like, how can we just do this little wavering in the middle? Because it is going to change from administration to administration, or election to election, in Congress in particular. But how do you do that? And I think it's really, we the people have to demand it, and that radical middle needs to get louder. Like the stuff you hear on the far right and the far left, they make a lot of noise, and that, for the media in particular, like, let's talk about that. Like, they don't talk about compromise. Like, compromise is like a dirty word. I'm like, man, like, I wouldn't be married if there wasn't, if I didn't compromise, right? And like, I probably wouldn't, somebody, you go out drinking with friends, and if somebody was like, nope, we're only gonna, drink Busch Light, I'd be like, fuck that. And like, but like, oh, well, let's compromise, and you can have the Busch Light, and I can have whatever I want. Like, I just, compromise has become a dirty word, but I think it's like finding that common ground, right? And I think we need to think more about that. And the more we talk about that and try to, find shared values, the pushback, honestly, with the Republicans having the presidency and having both houses, like, those that voted Republican have a bigger voice than anybody else right now. And I'm pushing back against this. And I think you saw that in particular with that sale of public lands in the House. And, Ryan Zinke from my home state of Montana, played a part with this Public Lands Caucus to get that stuff pulled. Though I like to say, and one of my friends kind of said this to me, and I'll repeat it, is that, everybody's celebrating Zinke for getting the public land sale out of this reconciliation bill. But that's like celebrating the waiter that gets the hair out of the soup. It's like, that shit should have never been in there in the first place, right? Like, you got to go after like Celeste Malloy and Mark Amadei. Those are the two Congress folks that put that in there in the first place. By the way, in the dead of night, so that nobody could see it. But, like, I'm glad that Mr. Zinke went to work, but I think that it was really the American people that said hell no on that. So, John, great question. I think philosophically, we just need to think about that radical middle more.
Yeah. Do you think that American hunters and anglers, like, is there sort of a core philosophy? I know that we talked a lot about the way the organization is built, allows you to spend money in a way that is a little bit more aggressive. But is there something about it that kind of beyond its function, that you communicate to people to help them get involved, or to promote what you're doing, to grow that membership? How does that relate to maybe that sort of philosophical approach that we were just talking about?
I think it's the way democracy works is the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And I think really empowering people to be a part of that is something that is kind of life-changing for people, right? Like, again, like, a lot of them, politics sucks in a lot of ways, right? Like, people don't want to get involved. But if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so that, like, how do you get involved? And like, it's making that easy for people, and less threatening. And I think that, social media is a place where you can talk to people every single day. And they start to follow and they start to watch what you're doing. And they might not agree with everything you're doing, or maybe it's even sometimes the way you say it, but it's starting to prick something in their mind, like, oh, I need to get involved here. And so philosophically, John, like, I think these threats are always going to be there because there's so much money to be made by the privatization, right? Like, there's just so much money to be made. Mm-hmm. But I really feel in my heart of hearts that there can be this kind of, again, I've used the word demanding our politicians that no matter where you sit on the political spectrum, that this issue is sacrosanct and you do not touch it, right? And if you do, that stove gets super ass hot. Yeah. And so that when that gets hot, whew, let's not do that again for another decade, which is basically where we are right now. And so, that I think it's, and then I think also like we get into these kind of, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, and so I have to defend every single thing that they do. Right. No, you don't. That's not like I don't agree with any party like at all. Like wholeheartedly. And so you can call out the things you don't like, and you can call out the things you do like, right? And I think that's okay. Like it's okay to go against your tribe. Yeah, and that accountability, Tim, that you're talking about, like it's so important, and people are nervous about it sometimes, but I think it's super important, and it's a way to again get us to that radical middle. And at American Hunters and Anglers, we call it like we see it. I've talked about Aldo Leopold already. We look at the North American wildlife conservation model too, and it's pretty simple. Democracy of the hunt is my favorite one out of that, but that democracy of the hunt means that it's available to anybody, right? And that's that ability to not only have these lands to go roam, but also the ability that you don't have to, go buy an elk for $16,000, and shoot it, or like it's way. That democracy of the hunt, I think, is absolutely important, and so we make our decisions on that. And if I think when people realize that like it's kind of based on Aldo Leopold, the North American model, it's kind of hard to argue with.
Yeah. Gosh, I have so many things, but it's like. You touched on it very early in the conversation, and then you brought up the word compromise just recently. Yeah. And that I think we can all probably agree, like, government is bloated, government is too fat, and it spends too much money, and it wastes too much money, and all these things. So I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second.
Yeah.
A big argument that a lot of folks are making is like, one, that we're spending too much money, and the government's too big, and these organizations are too big. And so, 25 years ago was when Land should have been making his argument to, save this stuff. But at this point, we're in such a position that we've got to get rid of some of this cost and some of these expenses to get our country back on the right track, right? And so that means letting the forest burn, and we know that through conservation, it can be a very healthy thing to let a forest fire burn itself out.
Totally.
So like, what do we say to those folks that are like, nah, like you guys are on crack. Like we gotta make some money off this public land. We gotta cut some of this spending from these organizations, to get us back on track.
Yep.
I want to hear your take on that.
And thank you for asking the question and playing devil's advocate. I think that, one of the first things I would say is that I think we as kind of conservation community and leaders do a better job about talking about the history of these public lands and how like these budgets have gone down like for the last 2 decades for the management of these public lands. And so while I still think there's some fat to trim, they were pretty freaking lean before any of this stuff happened. And so let's take that into account. Then I go back to this $1.2 trillion like outdoor economy that is based on our public lands. If we help care and feed that economy, right? Care and feed our public lands. That's this investment that is sustainable for generations to come, right? And like, you want to talk, $1.2 trillion is nothing. That's a big number. Right. And I wish I had stats. The Outdoor Industry Alliance kind of puts these numbers together. And I think, they talk about how that's, bigger than oil and gas put together, right? And like, many other industries that are out there. And so I think that people need to understand that piece too. And so again, we start divesting and privatizing, and yes, you're going to make some money off of that, but it's not going to be the 1.2 trillion that we have right now. And that's going to, precipitously go down, and it's going to be the wealthy that have the opportunities and the, the unwashed masses that don't. So I think I would say that. And then, I think, we haven't talked about a lot this yet, but, when I hear the word like energy dominance, right, that comes out of a lot of people's mouth, and we need to like, get as much as we can. And I'm like, okay, that goes back to Theodore Roosevelt back in the day. That's short-term stuff, man. And like, should we be energy independent? Absolutely. In this world that we're living in right now, absolutely. And let's do that in a sustainable fashion. I think the Arctic is a great example. last administration, there was a big push to do development up in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and they put out these big lease sales, and nobody purchased them because like it wasn't feasible to do.
Yeah.
And so now it's like this, like just this, this. If you can do it in the Arctic, you can do it kind of anywhere, right? Kind of thing. I think is the way that I kind of look at that. And so, yeah, do we need to do oil and gas development? Sure, but when companies don't even want to develop up in the Arctic, there's a reason for that. And and I think the mining stuff in, Minnesota is really short-sighted too. And so how do you do sustainable development, which still gets, I think money off of our public lands? And then I'm no, like, genius on other parts of the economy, outside of the outdoor industry, but we seem to be spending a lot on the military, and we seem to be spending a lot on tax breaks for billionaires. And I, whether you are philosophically on that stuff, there's other places to be cut besides, what they're doing to the public lands, like agencies, that is huge impacts on the ground, like gigantic impacts on the ground, is doing nothing really to that overall budget, right? Yeah. Like it's
small potatoes.
It's small potatoes, it's chump change. It's like the change that you find in your couch, and so like it's more about philosophy at that point, and it's not about the economy. It's about privatizing it for themselves. And so I think Tim, even like one more thing I guess I would add to that is that, okay, so maybe you do believe in like privatizing these lands. Like how much money do you have to compete with all these billionaires to go buy that land? And like, are you going to be, paying these leases, every single year just to go hunt like your one weekend,
right? Mm-hmm.
Versus what we have now, which is unfettered access for the most part to public lands, 640 million acres all across this country, to literally do kind of what we want, without having to look over our shoulders. And, so I don't know. That's a long-winded way of saying that. I think it's the simple thing there, though, is that let's not mess with that $1.2 trillion economy.
Yeah. And I think, we talk about that $1.2 trillion economy, and that's money that I opened an outdoor store because of that $1.2 trillion.
Totally,
economy,
you're part of
right?
it. You're part of it.
So it's like that's money that goes into like an American family that stays in an American community that supports youth sports and other small town initiatives throughout America, and
totally.
That 1.2 trillion isn't going just right back into the government to fund silly things that we know they like to fund.
Yeah, it's funny. I think this is why I love that it's American hunters and anglers, because to me it's what is the most American thing you can do. Like there's something there that feels old, true, like even the term self-evident, like it's these like core words that I feel like we've built this country on, and it's not hard to apply that to this issue. And we talk so much about selling them off and going, but it's about protecting. Like we're not saying that the federal government is going to own them. It's about protecting them. And I think that's the thing that we're getting away from. And it blows my mind. And maybe it's because I have been getting more and more into this stuff that people can't see that. Like, again, that's self-evident. Like, I don't understand why it's not more self-evident, but I think with what you're doing, what you're, encouraging people to do, to get out there, to call, to talk, to just even talk to their friends, just so it becomes more of a conversation, I think it will start to feel that way. But again, what is the most American thing we can do? Politics aside, like take care of these lands because of not just the economy that it creates, but the benefit. Going back to that mountain lion that you saw, the fish that you caught, my first time catching a fish on the fly the other day, and just how amazing that feels to have these new experiences.
In a public park.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just going camping, backpacking, whatever, going for a day hike, like that's what we're taking away. And that to me is like, it doesn't make any sense. Yeah. Like why we would not want to protect that.
And so many of these, look, there's a lot of like very wealthy private land, and I hunt private land, I fish private land, I hunt public land, I fish public land. There's a lot of people that are adamantly like, oh, we sell them off, we don't need them. Well, your ranch borders lots of public land, mm-hmm. and how's it going to be when that turns into lithium mine, like, or condos, or, like whatever. So I think, and that's like the long term, like, let's think, and that's not even, that's, we don't even have to think super long term to see that that's the way things are going to go if this land gets sold off and privatized.
I mean, John, it's American exceptionalism. This country's not that old, but we wanted to be different, especially from European kind of model. That European model is where the kings and the queens, the royalty, own the property and they own the game. Yeah. And by penalty of death, like think Robin Hood, right? Like that is real. And so like, while people here in the United States might take this stuff for granted, people over in Europe don't. Like they're like, get it together, right? Because what you have is something that nobody else really does in the world. And so I think, that's such an important distinction that, I think is really for all of us to be talking about.
Yeah. Well, I don't think I thought of that way, but thinking about it on a global, like we're not just protecting it for Americans, like it literally is like on behalf of the world.
Oh, dude.
I mean, how many people come here from all over the world to go to a lot of these parks?
Totally.
Totally. That's a whole nother level. And I think if more people even thought about it that way, it might really, start to ring in their ears,
Well, and I've had many a conversation with many a European that's, like, wait, so you can just go there and you can just camp there and you can just shoot a gun there? Yeah, bring all your guns.
Yeah. I think, Tim, you said something earlier too about like just kind of like the rural economy a little bit, right? Like you talked about how, at your business, like you're a real family. Like sometimes people think about these recreational jobs and they're not real jobs, right? And I think that's a bunch of bullshit.
Yeah.
But I also think about like these rural economies, and hunting season in particular is like Christmas for them for like 3 or 4 months, right? Like all these people come in and they, they go to the local gas station, they go to the local diner, there's
signs up,
hotels.
welcome hunters.
Totally.
Absolutely, right? And that's for a good reason. And I think, you said something else, like, I never want people to say when I talk poetically or waxing about, like public lands and how important they are, like private lands are essential to this whole kind of conservation model that we have in this country too. And the public land, private land interface, a lot of these private lands are intertwined with public land. And so they're an important part of kind of their business model. But then just in general, like, a lot of these species that we love to chase around, they winter, on private land because that's those lower lands, right? And, or they, they nest, like they say nesting like ducks or whatever. And so I think there's this partnership. And then, we haven't talked about this yet, but like in the budget, they're cutting all these farm bill conservation programs. They're cutting like the NRCS, which is the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which basically delivers like conservation programs to private landowners on the ground.
Yeah.
Like they're not going to be able to like fulfill these programs. And so these rural economies that, and I think private landowners in particular that depend on these programs are going to have those things cut out underneath them. And it's going to be devastating. I mean, I think we're already seeing, access wise, like the Corps of Engineers, which really people don't look at that agency as, a big public lands agency. Well, they got like, I think over 1,000 kind of lakes and reservoirs that they manage over the country. Like they're being shut down right now because they don't have the people to manage them. And so, what happened this last weekend, Memorial Day weekend or 2 weekends ago, when all these people want to take their boats out and go, sure, they're pissed that they can't go on the lake anymore, but how about that local bait shop? How about that local like hotel or like, like the local diner again? Like these people are going to stop coming.
Yeah.
And that's already happening with our national parks. I think there's something like these first 2 months have been like, lower visitation when we've been having record visitation for like the last 2 decades, every single year on our national parks. Like there's a chilling effect. And while that is like, oh, okay, not as many people are getting outside, what that does for the, like those rural economies that are based like these, like, what do they call them? Like, they're not bedroom communities, but like these, like, these communities that are right next to like these big pieces of public land or national parks, whatever, like they're going to lose out, man. And that is just, that's going to create more, I think, bad will towards these, well, we better privatize them because we can't, but then that just, it changes the whole game.
And it's no secret, like, America's at its strongest when mom and pop are at their strongest. And when they stop stopping at the gas station and grabbing the breakfast burrito and mom and pop goes out of business, well, then mom and pop is on unemployment, and then they need food stamps, and then they're like, then they're bloating the government yet again. So it's a vicious cycle, and actually a relatively simple one. One thing I do want to touch on, Land, and I mentioned it at the very beginning of our conversation that you've always been a great educator when it comes to public land and waters, and also a fan and dare I say scholar of Teddy Roosevelt. Speak softly and carry a big stick. That's not what you're doing, man.
Roosevelt also, that was a philosophy that he had, when he was that was more international, I would say, policy. But Roosevelt, he stood up against his own party to do the things that he did. And I don't think people understand that. And he was very forceful on conservation in particular. And no, I'm not speaking softly, and it's partly because this shit matters so much to me. And then I also think, going back to John, so goes our public land, so goes America, right? If we start to dismantle these public lands, I think that's the beginning of the end, right? And I think Rome is burning right now, and I'm not ready to hey, we should change the color of the paint on our house. No, it's freaking burning, and we need to put this fire out, because if we don't, it's going to be too late. So actually just got done reading a Theodore Roosevelt book, which is super fascinating. I read way too much on him and got kind of bored of it, to be honest. And then a friend of mine gave me this. What's that?
Which one did you just finish?
Well, I actually have it right here, because I just got it done. It's called Becoming Theodore Roosevelt.
Okay.
And it's about, he was in New York City, and he was this invalid, which I know a lot of people know he had asthma and, could hardly, function. And then he started getting outside and, making his body stronger and his lungs stronger. And he went up to Maine. And this book, while it talks about becoming Teddy Roosevelt, it's all about this guy named Bill Sewall, who was a guide up in Maine. And Maine was this this was back, when Manifest Destiny, everybody's going west to try to find, kind of these wild landscapes. Maine, and still today, I've never been to Maine, but it's got some crazy wild country up there. Yeah. And Roosevelt went up there, and lo and behold, he hung out with the people, which I think is another great philosophy that comes from Roosevelt. He was one of the people, even though he came from wealth. But he made his body strong, and he did that on, kind of these wild places. And this book is really about their relationship, and it takes all these kind of back and forth letters that they would write each other, which I just love thinking about how we text each other just little teeny things nowadays, but these guys are actually writing letters to each other. But it really talked about that philosophy with him. And Roosevelt, he could have been a man of wealth and said, I can kick this all for myself, right? But he, I think, the biggest one was when his wife and his mom died on the same day. Yeah. And his wife died during child labor. His mom had an ailment that was kind of coming on for a long time, but he lost. I can't imagine that. I lost my father. That was a huge hole, but I can't imagine your kid just was born, you lose your wife that you just absolutely adore, and then your mom dies. Roosevelt's dad died when he was young too, super young. So his mom was it, man. And and what did he do? He went west. He went to North Dakota, went to Medora, and where now Theodore Roosevelt National Park is, and it was rough country, not as great as Maine as the Maine guide will describe because he went out there, but that's where he found his peace. Mm-hmm. And really was man, I want this to be available to everybody. And I think that's really where this conservation ethic really started. But this book was about that. And, again, everybody's freaking out right now. And I get it. It's really bad. It's worse than I've ever seen it. But if you look at the conservation history, we've already talked about kind of the timber barons that was going on, timber harvest that was going on when Roosevelt was there. There was also market killing that was going on there too. And they were putting, feathers in women's hats, foods on table in San Francisco, Chicago, and New York with no really idea of sustainability. And we were wiping wildlife off the face of this country. Yeah. And that's when the Lacey Act was passed that Roosevelt ended up signing into law. They basically said you can't sell wildlife, in markets anymore. There's an exception for that for trapping in particular. But really, you can't, if you get elk in a restaurant, that's farm raised, just to be clear. Right. Mm-hmm. And so, that stopped. Then you go to the dirty 30s, right? The Dust Bowl is happening. and you have, like wildlife is in trouble again. Well, that's when Pittman Robertson's dollars were established. So the excise taxes on guns and ammunition to give back to state agencies to manage wildlife. You have the duck stamp where every single, hunter has to buy that. That goes back into national wildlife refuges. You got, National Wildlife Federation established, Ducks Unlimited. So out of some bad came some good. 1960s, Rachel Carson writes Silent Spring. And she writes about rivers on fire. Like they're literally on fire because of all the chemicals that are in them. Well, out of that kind of exposure and all that nastiness came the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the Wilderness Act, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, Endangered Species Act, and those were all passed with vast majorities in Congress. So out of some bad came some good, and so I'm looking at these pressures right now. And I've got some ideas of what I think can be the good, but one of the goods is like there's just going to unite people. But sometimes it's got to get really bad. I think people are complacent. I think hunters and anglers in general want to be left the F alone, right? Like they go out into the woods to be away from people and to escape, right? And they're like, why should I be doing this other stuff when I could just go outside? And I understand that. But I think these like overwhelming pressures hopefully bring people together, and we push back on the stuff that's bad, and then we look for things that can be forward thinking.
Well, what can people do? Maybe give us a little punch list of getting involved directly through AHA. Do you use that acronym?
Aha! we like the aha.
But what are the really specific things people can do? There, but also some of the more indirect stuff.
I'll talk about AHA first, and then I'll kind of get a little bit bigger. So with AHA, we're not a membership-driven organization. Sign up for our kind of updates that we do, mostly like press releases on stuff that's going on that like lets you know what's going on, but also activates you. The best place is to follow us on Instagram, because again, we're pretty much doing something every single day because there is so much coming at us, and so that'll keep you informed. Donate money if you can, right? Like, we don't have corporate partners. We're individually sponsored all across this country. And then we do calls of action on social media. There's a few ways to do that. So email is probably the easiest, but it's the least effective. And I'll just be totally honest about that. Like, these chiefs of staff, especially out in Washington, D.C., they're getting inundated, and they have staff that's like keeping check marks. Like, oh, I heard about this issue. And whether it's an email that all looks the same, which is the easiest way to do it, right? You don't even write your own email. You just it's already for you when you push send. That's not quite as effective with the people that are like making these decisions. The next step, I would say, would be picking up the phone. And that is super scary. There's a switchboard. It's 202-224-3121 that gets you out to DC. You say where you're from and that you want to be connected with, and then you say, I want to be connected with my senator or with my representative, and they will do that for you. And then you can simply say, public lands matter to me. If you want to get in more depth, you can talk about the issue that's going on. We will help you do that at AHA, or other organizations will do that. But make those phone calls. Those seem to break through way better than the emails. But still, there's so many issues in this country, and there's people that are blowing up those phone lines, and so it's not as effective as it probably once was. But I think those phone calls are important. I think the next piece is social media, and so it's this great venue to show your friends what you care about. So when you're sharing stories, that's getting the word out more, right? When you're liking posts, that's like elevating those things, and so do that as much as possible. And then one thing we found out, which I thought was pretty rad, because it was a tactic that we used back with Congressman Chaffetz, but I talked about how he introduces this bill, and then a week later he pulls back his support. Well, he got his ass kicked on social media in particular, right? Like people were going back 6 months on posts and putting in there, and some of them not so nice, which I don't think is okay, right? Like I understand where people are pissed, but try to be a little bit respectful. Going back 6 months, people were like, hey man, like don't sell out our public lands, don't sell off these public lands. And that got his attention in a big way. And so I think it's public, where these phone calls aren't public, these emails aren't public, right? Like they're going kind of one way in, there's no feedback.
Right.
On social media, like everybody sees that. And so they have to, and again, like you can do that on posts that have nothing to do with public lands and public wildlife, but you're like, hey man, keep public lands in public hands, or like, don't support all the firing of these employees, whatever it is. Like doing that on their socials, I think is highly effective. John or Tim, I think one of you guys mentioned earlier too, is like talking to your friends. I think that we are kind of isolated, maybe even since COVID in some ways, but like social media is doing that too. I just talked about how we can talk to friends there, but that's way different than, talking to somebody face to face. And so I think that is something that we should all be doing, is talking to our neighbors, talking to our dentist, talking to, anybody that you interact with. I think it's it's a responsibility to be kind of having these conversations. And then the last one, which is probably the most effective, is like talking to these politicians face to face. And not everybody can fly out to Washington, D.C., right? Like, that's expensive. And I will say at that point, talking to an actual elected leader is going to be tough. You're going to be talking to staff mostly, and they're going to have 40 or 50 meetings that day, right? But these folks come home all the time. And they were just home for Memorial Day. They're going to be back again at the July recess, trying to figure out where they are, and we call them intercepts, but really trying to figure out, how you might get 5 seconds with them. But if you're like, man, my name is Tim Bremer, and I thank you for representing me out in Washington, D.C. I care about public lands, and I want to make sure that they stay in public hands. Like, just that, like that, and like looking them in the eye, like I think that is super effective.
Human connection.
So there's it's like that connection, right? And like, finding kind of common ground, I think, with those people too. And politicians are pretty rad. Like, they want to talk to people. I mean, I think there's some that are avoiding people right now because they know the ire is pretty high. But I think that, finding those opportunities to connect that way is important as well. And then, I mean, again, AHA is not a membership organization, partly because we don't want to compete with the backcountry hunters and anglers or the trout unlimiteds of the world or the wild sheeps, right? And so belonging to those organizations, I think, is super important too. Yep. And so, like, we're all in this together, and so I think that, the more that we're part of something that's bigger than us, the better and the louder our voices get. But that's kind of a list, John, of, like, it's kind of things to do. But I think, telling your own story too. I've been talking to Senator Heinrich about this the other day, is that, storytelling is so powerful. And, I think that it's something that, Tim, you've heard me talk about, but like, since like the first fire that was ever made, right? When they were scratching sticks together, banging rocks together, and all of a sudden they got fire. I guarantee you they talked about stories that night around that fire about, whatever woolly mammoth they saw, or they've been trying to do this fire for frickin', 5 years, and they finally got, I mean, they were telling stories, right? And so it's this connection to people. I think Sigrid Olsen would talk about it like, when those sparks are going up in the air, that's these shared sparks that generations have been, feeling that same thing. And so that's I think cool. Telling stories, and and again, people can do that on social media. And so tell your own story, and I'm seeing that more now than I ever have on social media in particular, as people are telling their stories. And you might not think you're breaking through, but I think you are, and keep doing that. So that's a list.
It's literally what we're doing.
Yeah, that's why we're doing this, man.
Yeah, and I didn't go into it too much, but I mentioned I'm new to this. I grew up in the Bay Area, and guns were off the table. Like, that was the farthest thing from what I wanted to be involved with. You're bumping up against the REI crowd that is can somewhat be a little bit superficial about the outdoors. The Patagucci kind of stuff. I like Patagonia, but anyway. So I kind of grew up in that, right? And then coming down here to the Central Coast, where my wife is from, and I've been out here for more than 10, 12 years, something like that now, getting involved in this kind of stuff and starting to try to tell more of these stories. I've definitely seen a lot of people in the Bay Area, some old friends I have. I work for a New York creative agency. I've seen a lot of those people really embrace it. We actually ended up getting 511 as a client, which was like, a lot of agencies turn them down because of their proximity to guns. But the fact that I'm not saying I'm taking credit for our agency opening up to that, but I do like to think that there's a little bit of that there.
You can take credit.
And I know for a fact they literally told me they put me on that client pitch because they knew I was into hunting.
Yeah.
And just hearing more and more people, I openly talk about hunting, and I talk to at work, and I know a lot of people who work for a tech company or a creative agency, and they are like closeted hunters. Yeah. And I think that's a shame. Talk about it. Who cares? Yeah. And I think the more you do, the more people will realize how amazing it is. And that will start to, again, it's not just about hunting and fishing, but that is an area where I think we can really start to tell these stories and open up this narrative, which ultimately I think is going to lead to more of this collective change.
Yeah.
You know, I've had the great opportunity to hunt ducks in the bay.
Oh,
and
cool.
I've had the opportunity to like go fishing. Like we went underneath the Golden Gate and went fishing for salmon, like right outside of the Golden Gate. And so like, it's like these things are there too sometimes, John. Like you don't even know it, right? Like you know, and like there's like, I mean, think about that population. It's so
They're
big.
happening,
and it's happening out there. You just don't know it, right? Like you know, and it's probably some of those people that hunt ducks out there are like, shh, you know. But it was super rad. Like we were up against an old shipwreck. That was like our backstop, so the ducks couldn't see us behind us, right? Like nice. I mean, it was absolutely amazing. But I think you know, like that whole like Patagonia kind of REI world too. It goes back to that conversation, you know, that almost first question that Tim asked me, right? It's like how do you find that shared ground? And don't start with like, oh, I'm a hunter, and like you're like a Patagoonier, you know. Totally. Like it's like no, like well, what's that common ground? And like Yvon Chouinard, like when we were at Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, who you know founded Patagonia, was like he spoke at our annual meeting, and I think his staff was pretty nervous about how he's going to be received, and he got a standing ovation, you know, like because like I think there's that shared kind of vision that you know, again, we may do things differently, but you know, I think at the end of the day, we really share more than we don't.
That's a great point. Yeah, definitely.
Well, Land Tawney, I always tell people that you are America's public land and water hype man, and you're the best. You're the best the public land and water mascot. So, man, we appreciate you coming on. And,
I mean, it's the gap teeth, right? I think that's the mascot part. Maybe, I don't know.
No, man. Mascots, they pump people up. They get them pumped, you know? Yeah. So, you know, but you do it in a way that is, it's engaging. And, you know, I think one of the biggest things that we talk about with this podcast and the films we make and all that stuff is like, it's accessible. And like, you're an accessible guy, and you can have conversations with anybody. And I think, you know, we joke that oftentimes on this podcast we get the misfits of the outdoors. So you're one of the misfits too, just so you know.
Love it. Yeah. Please put me on there.
Yeah, man. Yeah. And
that's true, right?
No, it is. It is. And I think we've always been that way. And that's why we met at the corner there, Corner Club. You know. But yeah,
I love that people that don't know, like they think this Corner Club is like some bar or something maybe, but it was like literally in this like field that was like hot as shit, and like we had tents on the corner, and like we would come back and hang out after, you know, the festivities and like really actually hang out and get to know each other. And I think that was
Eddie
like,
and Trokey and Drew. And,
I see Drew's art right behind you.
Drew, I'm gonna hunt with Drew.
And I don't know if you know, he just got they had the first like 3D archery spot in like Illinois. It's open to the public, and like they just opened that here with like the last like month, which is
dude. He's been working his tail off on that, man.
Tail off, dude. Tail off. Which you know, I mean, that's like we've talked about a lot of stuff, but here's this dude that you know he worked with other people, but he drove that whole thing.
Yeah.
Took him years to do, and now it's happening.
Yeah.
And now you have a place where the public can go. And it's becoming so much more accessible, right? Like, you know, like things that like, you know, like and for people. And so there's all these individual actions, again, John, going back to what you asked. Like, I think no matter what you do, just do something, right? Like, you know, like don't sit there paralyzed or like, oh, it's not my problem. No, it's all of our problems. We got to do something about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely.
On that note, thanks, buddy.
Yeah. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you guys, and I mean I haven't said it yet. We've talked about social media and stuff, but like these podcasts where you actually can have a conversation are so important. And I was excited to be on this today. As soon as you asked me, you know, like it took us a little bit to totally get it scheduled, which is totally awesome because that's the way life goes or whatever, you know. But like I'm thankful for you guys' time and just like the opportunity to kind of, you know, utilize you guys' platform that, you know, people are listening to, and hopefully they've learned something today, and we'll take something away from this that, you know, none of what happened that we're talking about happened by accident, and none of it's going to be carried forward by accident either. And it's up to all of us to help drive what that looks like into the future.
Very intentional.
So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah. Well, if you get out to California, man, let's fish or go chase some pigs, and I'll hit you up when I'm in Montana.
I'd love that. And like, I mean, it's there's so many opportunities in this country, but if you're in Montana, let's talk. And then I was down in California with my daughter, and she was playing soccer, and I saw these people fishing, and it was like, I have to go over there and watch a soccer game, and I wanted to go fishing. So I'll be in touch about that stuff too.
Awesome. Thanks, buddy. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks, you guys.